Hello everybody. In this series of A Life in Cars, I've spoken to some people that I know about the cars and events that have defined them. Today, I'm speaking to somebody you probably know, Dr. Andy Palmer, perhaps best known for his role as CEO of Aston Martin during a difficult and controversial period for the company. He is directly responsible for the current lineup of Vantage, DB11, DBS, and perhaps most significantly, the DBX. Very kindly, he offered to sit down and chat with me candidly in the workshop and man cave he has built for himself. But due to his busy schedule, I had just 2 hours, so rather than ask all of the common questions about what happened at Aston Martin, I wanted to know about his journey there. I am so glad that I did, because what I found was a passionate, excitable, and genuine car guy. So today, let me introduce you not to Dr. Andy Palmer, CEO, but instead Andy, the engineer.
I was brought up in Stratford-on-Avon. I call Stratford my hometown. I had a perfect family with my mum and my dad and my brother and I. My dad was a manufacturing engineer, and to some extent, I guess he was responsible for my interest in cars. He also was a fan of cars, and he bought me my first A-Series engine when I was 14 years old, which created a passion for wanting to become an automotive engineer. And because he had also been educated through an apprenticeship, in many respects it was almost ordained that I was going to do the same and do my degrees later. And so my father, who regrettably is no longer with us, was a huge influence in that early part of my career. Dad's first cars, there was nothing special. We weren't a particularly wealthy family, but it was what I would call a Moggy Minor, a Morris Minor. I remember him being particularly proud of a Traveller. He had a couple of Travellers. Then he got into Escorts. The one that stuck out in my mind, because it was the first car that I drove at 14 years old, was an Alfa Sud. And essentially him teaching me on Wellesbourne Airfield how to do power changes. Well, certainly in 1980, when I was 17 years old, the car I dreamed of was the Aston Martin Vantage. I was probably more knowledgeable about the other cars, the day-by-day cars that were out on the road, Ford Angular or the Mini, and to be honest, that's been a theme throughout my career. Whilst I've done the supercars and the Aston Martins in my career, I've also done the vans and the trucks and the Nissans and the Austins of the world, where the challenge is always one of making technology affordable. And I think in many respects that's the most interesting part of automotive, how to create an EV competitive bus, for example, has as many challenges as creating the Valkyrie. Another thing that my father contributed was a love of 2 or 3 books. Mechanisms for Inventors and Designers, I think, was the name of the title. And I've got a copy upstairs. It's basically fascinating because it shows you different mechanisms for, if you want to make rotational force go that direction, these are the types of mechanisms that you can use. And I was fascinated by this book. I used to sit on the landing in our upstairs of my family house and just read it for hours. A bit geeky, I know, but there was never a doubt from at least the age of 14 about what I was going to do. I was going to be an engineer in the automotive business, and I find that to have been one of my greatest strengths. I look at my kids and they weren't passionate about what they wanted to do. They were still, my son probably still finding what he wants to do. But I knew at 14 that was exactly what I wanted to do. And I knew at 20 that what I wanted to be was an automotive CEO. I remember going with my dad when he was going to buy an Avenger. While he was deciding, I was going, "Oh, Dad, please, 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 please buy it. It's so cool." Now, I look at an Avenger now and wonder what I was thinking. But I think I was just in love with cars. Now, it's true, 1980 was the year that I passed my driving test, and the ultimate car at the time was the Vantage. And basically the car in my collection is a 1980 Vantage for exactly that reason. It was the fulfilling of a childhood dream. It was the first British muscle car, and it just stood out on the roam. It was just giving if I may, a sort of you to the rest of the world, that we can create cars like this, and it is simply the best of everything. To be honest, I never ever thought that I'd be able to have one of my own. It was just something that was just a fantasy. So my first car was actually a moped. So like most apprentices, you're 16 years old and you've got to get to work, and the only way you can do that is on a moped. And so that was an RD50, little Yamaha. My first car was, I bought my mom's Polo, Mark 1 Polo, 900cc engine. And that's where I learned to drift and a few other things. So that was my freedom, and I loved it. And I had that followed by, believe it or not, a Volvo. I think it was a 345 Volvo, and then I started going into more company cars. So MG Maestro was the first company car. Then probably what felt at the time like the pinnacle of my career, I got into a Rover 825. The 825 was the 800 series with the 2.5 litre Honda engine, and I was king of Stratford. I don't remember how old I was, probably 22, 23 years old, and suddenly I was mooning around in this just beautiful motor car, and that Honda engine was just so good. So one of the proudest moments of my automotive life, actually having that car. So obviously the apprenticeship was my entry into automotive, and it was at a company called Automotive Products, or AP, that doesn't exist anymore actually, but basically made brakes and clutches and some advanced technology around gearboxes. And I worked my way through a 4-year apprenticeship and ended up in advanced engineering, which proved to be quite useful later, working on what was then a twin wet clutch. Again, unheard of back then, but gave me a good understanding of powertrain, frankly speaking. I stayed at Automotive Products for 4 years of the apprenticeship and 3 years after. The thing that struck me during my apprenticeship, AP was always out on strike. And as I came out of my apprenticeship, it was mandatory to join a union. It was a closed shop. And we seemed to be constantly down the road. It was the days of Red Robbo. And I looked at it, I was more interested in developing gearboxes than I was in striking. And it just struck me as a complete failure of not just the union system, but of management. And being an arrogant little bugger at the time, I just felt that I could do it better. That if I was managing in these circumstances, I wouldn't allow it to get to a strike. And so I took myself off to night school, and I did a degree in industrial management. That got me my first job in Rover, Austin Rover, British Leyland, and that allowed me, because it was felt to be very important in Rover management. They put me on a master's degree in engineering at Warwick University, and that got me that degree. But it also started to step me through the roles of management, and I ended up, my last job at Rover was Chief Vehicle Engineer of Transmissions, and I learned a heck of a lot during that whole period. But the thing that I learned most was working with Honda, because of the relationship between Rover and Honda, and how come the quality and the reliability of the Japanese parts was so much superior to the stuff that Rover was doing. So I figured that there was something that I wasn't understanding about the Japanese way of working. And at the same time, I read a book that was called The Machine That Changed the World, which of course was all about the transformation that the Japanese were having on the auto industry. And I thought, I've got to go and work for a Japanese company. Maybe 3 or 4 years, get that experience and come back. I went to work for Nissan, and I worked there for 23 years. 10 years in the UK, and then 13 years living in Japan. And for sure, I learned a lot. It taught me a lot around the psychology of developing vehicles. It also gave me an opportunity to get both my PhD in engineering and my MBA. So I owe a lot to Nissan and that experience. Rover was a great place. I mean, there was a lot wrong with Rover. But as an educational tool, it was amazing. The engineers were all quite young. There was quite a high turnover of engineers. Youth means both lack of experience, but it also means a certain amount of bravery. And there were things that we did at Rover that just allowed me to learn so much about the construct of a car. I mean, I didn't know what simultaneous engineering was back then, but when we had 12 weeks to fit a gearbox to a diesel engine in a metro, the only way you could do that, the only way you could engineer a bell housing to allow that to happen, and all of the mechanisms and NVH, was to do it simultaneously with manufacturing engineering, with design engineering, with the management, with the cost group. And so what I learned was if you can assimilate a team around a cause, you can do anything. You can do anything. And so a lot of the changes that I've been able to do during my career, for example, the advent of the Leaf, the first electric vehicle, has been inspired from the management of people that I learned at Rover. Kaizen, the Gemba and Gemba Cannery, which is basically, Gemba is the shop floor and a meeting, or Gemba Kai is the meeting at the shop floor. So it empowers the bottom of the organisation, because the bottom of the organisation are the people most familiar with the problems, the most capable of solving things, as opposed to what was the Rover methodology, which is you look to your boss and your boss's boss, and there was a lot of politics. What I saw was a revolution in the way that the Japanese were developing the vehicles and making them significantly better than the ones that we were making. And the Brits at Rover were very innovative, very brave in pushing forward technologies, but didn't pay enough attention to quality and reliability. You started to see, of course, the emergence of people thinking around emissions. And there was the start of the catalyzer. In particular, one of my most memorable projects was putting a catalyst on the Mini. All of the traditional departments had said it wasn't possible, and there'd been a decision made at the board to kill the Mini. My team, young, naive, brave, we found a way of getting a catalyst in. And so we breathed an extra few years of life into the Mini, and you know, that's my homage to Alex Izigonis, that I could extend that vehicle just a little bit longer. The other thing you started to see around that time was the growing importance of crash safety, what we sometimes call passive safety. So you started to see the rise of course, seat belts and seat anchorage, and the effect that has on the architecture of a vehicle, but also the advent of airbags, crash management, so you know, the ergonomics of crash management, and that became a big deal through the back end of the 80s and certainly during the 90s. So those two key drivers, I think. I'll add one more, which was, I think, and led by probably the Volkswagen Group, was the emphasis on perceived quality. So the gap and flush started to become important. Tactile materials started to become important. You had companies like VW, the VW Group, standing out from the crowd for making affordable but beautiful finishes to vehicles. So Life came at me with basically an advert in the Birmingham Telegraph to join what was called NETC at that time, became NTCE, but that was Nissan Technical Centre, and that was the Japanese recognising that they needed more than just manufacturing in the country. They needed an engineering capability, particularly for localisation. And they decided, Nissan decided that they would establish that in Cranfield. And I was one of the first employees to start up in Cranfield in that facility. 1991, I think it was, that I started at Nissan in Cranfield, and I was there 10 years, eventually rising to be the head of Nissan engineering in Europe. During the latter part of that, of course, Renault came along and the alliance with Renault, and Mr. Ghosn then picked me out to become one of his, what he called his 6 samurais. In my case, I became responsible as program director for light commercial vehicles. It was a completely different style of management between Rover, which was testosterone and politics, and Nissan, which was quiet, collective, fact-based, persuasive, nemawashi, which is basically pre-discussion. Losing your temper in Rover was normal. Bashing the table was normal. Swearing, effing and blinding was normal. None of those apply in a Japanese environment because you just lose face. And to lose face in an Eastern culture is to have lost the argument. So it was radically different. And ultimately was a culture that I found myself ultimately being quite comfortable in. So to win the argument as an engineer based on data and fact rather than on threatening and emotion was just a more comfortable place to be, which of course is why I ended up staying there for 23 years. I was lucky enough right at the very beginning and joining the company that I was working for a guy called Ken Foxley and Ian Milburn. Both of them, I think, had marked me out as a future leader, and both thought it was really important that I did both some time on the production line in Sunderland, but also very early on basically got acquainted with the Japanese company. So I went out to Japan within the first month of being at the company. You hear a lot of bad things about Carlos Ghosn. Carlos Ghosn, on the other hand, was a brilliant man. In particular, he didn't see the colour of your skin or the colour of your passport or your gender, in fact. What he saw, dollars and pounds and yen, and he looked through the lens of meritocracy for the best people. And so when Renault came in and essentially took over Nissan, it was called an alliance, but in reality it was a takeover. He toured the Nissan world and he understood, I think, the importance of mixing more of the international Nissan into the Japanese Nissan. He took a shine to me on his tour of Cranfield and the technology centre there. Because I was there before the alliance, the Japanese guys saw me as a Nissan guy, and he saw me as an international businessman, and it worked in both cases. And I had, I suppose, the greatest acceleration of my career as a result of taking that job. Also turmoil, because I had to go and live in Japan. So I had to up sticks and go to essentially a new country, and living in a country is very different from visiting a country. I was divorced, I was single at the time, and so it was a big change, but the learning was just enormous. As a program director, it was my first non-technical job. So up to that point, it had culminated in being head of engineering for Nissan in Europe. This was the step into management. Now, program director has a responsibility for a car line. So there were 6 car lines in Nissan, 6 platforms. So B segment, C segment, D segment, Infinity, pickup and light commercial vehicle. So I had responsibility for all of the light commercial vehicle platforms. So whether they were vans, whether they were taxis, whether they were light trucks. And predominantly the program director is responsible for profit, but he has within his scope of responsibility, he has something called the CPS, which is the customer's voice, the product specialist, and the CVE, the chief vehicle engineer, that's responsible for quality, cost and delivery. And they sort of in a triangle headed by the program director. So you're responsible ultimately for everything, whether it's the engineering of the vehicle, the commercial prospects of the vehicle, but ultimately for the profitability. Essentially, you're mini CEO for 1/6 of the business. The main problem at the time was that the LCV line was the only line that was losing money. So in Ghosn's world, that's a big deal. So he was very focused on, I think we were selling, I think I'm right in saying 143,000 light commercial vehicles a year. So a very small amount actually. And we were underwater, significantly underwater at the level of EBIT. And so his point to me was transform that. And he gave me a lot of scope to be able to do that. When I left the company, Nissan was selling over 1 million light commercial vehicles, and at its peak we were doing 11% EBIT, so highly profitable, in the most profitable car line. So through the course of that, of course, there was creation of some really interesting products. One of my favorites, in fact, was the Cabstar, which is a light truck, which is of course a frame-based vehicle. But the difficulties of being able to meet Japanese regulation and European regulation with the same vehicle. The NV200, which is a van, the challenge there was to get a Euro pallet or 2 Euro pallets in the inside of the vehicle while constraining the width to 1.7 meters, because that's a Japanese regulation, but the European load requirement was 2 Euro pallets. So you end up with quite innovative suspension on that vehicle as a result. So I loved the light commercial vehicle world because it's very pragmatic. You're trying to solve for very well understood criteria. It's either volume or weight that are normally key to it. And of course there was the opportunity also there for the electrification. ENV200 became the second electric vehicle. So I love taxis, by the way, and the NV200 became the New York cab, and that was something that I was able to drive very personally to make that happen. But go to New York, you'll see NV200s painted yellow everywhere. You know, people ask me why I get so passionate about the car industry and why I've loved it and why I've served in it. Every car that I've been involved in, you leave a little bit of your soul in that car. And so when you're out on the road and you're looking around, or you're going to a different country and you see one of your children, you can say, I had a significant involvement in the steering wheel on that car, or the brakes on that car, or the air conditioning. Oh, do you remember that problem we had on the Infiniti Q50 with the electric steering system, or with the hi-fi system? And so, as I say, there's a little bit of you in every one of those automotive children. So I moved to the program director role in Japan. My boss was initially Patrick Palata. Patrick, of course, went back to Renault and became the COO of Renault, and Carlos Tavares, now CEO of Stellantis, became my immediate boss. During the Lehman shock in 2008, he was deployed to Nissan North America because that was the biggest area of survival capability, and I was promoted to what became SVP and then EVP, Executive Vice President of Planning. So I had product planning, corporate planning, market intelligence. Then I got sales. Then I got IT, and it grew and grew and grew. And then eventually I became Chief Operating Officer. During that period, I'd like to say that Nissan created its best vehicles because it was empowered to, and the fact that I had product planning on one side and marketing on the other, we created a vision for the company around innovation that excites, and we lived that vision by the creation of vehicles like Leaf and GTR, if you want the two bookends, and then everything in between. So we created some, I think, amazing cars: Duke, Qashqai, Altima, Titan. The specialist vehicles, they have a couple of effects. Of course, they have the trickle down of technology. So much of the technology that you'd find on a Micra today, particularly around ADAS, started life in an Infiniti, because it was only an Infiniti that could afford to have those systems. I'll give you an example of drive-by-wire. Drive-by-wire was basically pioneered in an Infiniti Q50. But now when you talk about electric cars, it's a part of the future, but this is 10 years ago. So those specialist cars are really important for that technological drip, drip, drip down to your lowest vehicles. Cars are often an emotional purchase as much as they are a practical purpose, and therefore brand is really important. And you brand build with vehicles like GTR, like the Z, and ultimately, whilst you don't necessarily buy it, you feel proud of driving your Qashqai because you know that the badge on the front is the same as a GTR. So brand value is also an important point. The last one, I think often underestimated, is the psychological effect that it has on the staff. When you're developing and you've had a chance for even a little input into something like a GTR, where you can get really passionate as an automotive engineer or even as an automotive marketer, you become passionate about the company and you give more. So it's really important not only for educating an engineer, but also just the motivational effect of having a car that that you can see on a racetrack. Why did Nismo become important? Nismo became important at going to the races, creating the Zeod, which was the 24-hour narrow front-ended car, the first Le Mans electric car that's do one full lap on electric. But the promotion of the Nismo brand allowed us to create the Z Nismo, the GTR Nismo, and importantly, the Duke Nismo. So you start to even democratize the values of Nismo, the values of racing, because you create a sub-brand, and that becomes really important.
For somebody like Andy, with such a back catalogue, you might imagine that the favourite car he was involved in would be an icon like the GTR, or perhaps something radical like the Valkyrie. But, in keeping with his love of the accessible, it's actually the humble Nissan Qashqai that he cites as one of his career highlights. So, I asked him about the genesis of that.
So it was very much a European Nissan. Certainly the very start of Qashqai was actually before the Alliance. It was my old boss, one of the original managing directors of NTCE, was a gentleman called Miata, quite a famous chassis engineer actually. And he went back and he became an executive vice president of engineering. And he called me up one day and said, "Andy, we know we don't understand Europe, and we know the Almera is not particularly successful. We don't really get the C segment. Some of our product planners have been sort of thinking around the idea of combining what we are good at, which is 4x4s, into the passenger, the C segment. What do you think? And by the way, would you come to Japan and would you give a presentation?" So I approached what was Nissan Europe, which was the marketing wing of Nissan Europe, and said, "They've got this idea, what do you think?" So Nissan Europe went away and came back with a presentation that said, essentially, it's a stupid idea. We just need a good Golf competitor. So I went off to Japan and sort of quickly gave this presentation to what was like 100 engineers in the room. But then I took it down and I said, but actually, my instinct is that reply is rubbish. And actually, I think what you need to do is you need to play on the strength of Patrol and the strength of Terrano, where we're recognized as being really strong, and transform the C segment. And I would encourage you to read the David Tuig book, because he was the chief vehicle engineer on that product. And it was through the rejection of that C segment Golf poor competitor that gave rise then to this study coming up that was, why don't we do a crossover? And it was that and David's execution of that vehicle that made a transformation of the C segment. Crossovers in the C segment are just normal now.
History can be a cruel thing. Ask many people about Andy Palmer and Aston Martin and they'll likely point to the failed IPO, Aston Martin's transition to being a publicly owned company, which many industry experts consider beyond his control. What is often left out is that he took the perennially loss-making Aston Martin and turned it into a firm generating its biggest profits on record. I also vividly recall reports that he personally inspected the first 1,000 DB11s off the line and supplied the new owners with his email address and phone number. That stuck with me because it's the mark of someone who takes the success of a company personally. No surprise really, as we now know what Aston meant to him as a young man. I would love to talk Aston with Andy, but truthfully, that's a topic for a video all of its own, and not one I had the time to go into. So instead, I wanted to ask how it was he landed the gig, his dream job of not just being a car company CEO, but of Aston Martin, to him and others, the ultimate brand.
Aston Martin, interesting. A few years before I actually joined, Ford had already sold Aston to the Kuwaiti shareholders, but Aston was in its perennial troubles. The Kuwaitis were looking for someone to co-join with them. Ultimately became Invest Industrial. From a corporate planning point of view, I'd seen the opportunity of Aston Martin in a company that for Nissan would have been Datsun, Entry, Nissan, Main, Infiniti, Premium, and Aston, Luxury. Perfect alignment. And so we had done quite a lot of due diligence, and I'd actually took it to Carlos Ghosn as a proposal to buy. There was three of us in the room, the CFO, Carlos Ghosn, and myself, and I lost the argument. But the consequence was I knew quite a lot about the company. A little later, I had a call from basically a guy at Invest Industrial saying, Andy, would you be interested? And I had just been promoted to COO at Nissan, and I said no. And a little bit later, Carlos Ghosn was in the start of his difficulties, where he was having to balance the French government and the Japanese governments around the ownership structure of Renault and Nissan. And he twice made a statement of the successor to me in Nissan is going to be Japanese. And to my point of view, that was the start of the meritocracy that Ghosn was so passionate about going out the window, and instead the politics coming in. And I don't have a Japanese passport. And you remember that 20-year-old that wanted to be the CEO of a car company. I had to look at myself and say, I love my job at Nissan. Do I love it enough that I'm going to give up on my 20-year-old dream? And the guy from Invest Industrial called me up again and said, would you be interested in being the CEO of Aston Martin? A guy called Dante. And I said, you know what? I think everything I've learned over the sort of 35 years at that stage is relevant to fixing what I know is wrong at Aston. It's 5 miles from where I went to school. There seems to be a whole circular coming home to this that really makes it feel like the right thing to do. And I said yes. And that's how I became the CEO of Aston. So I bought the 1980, because that's the year that I took my test, passed my test, the V8 Vantage. I got it in 2015 as the ultimate closure of the dream car. And I'd looked at two Vantages. One was an ex-Elton John car that was a little bit out of my price range. And this one, and the guys over at Aston Martin Works said, you know, a little bit of work, it could be really tidied up to something really quite special. And I went to see it, and it was British Racing Green. It was 1980, and it was like this is even the tape player works, because you can play the Stranglers as you're driving along, which is what I do. It just seemed to fit, and it takes me back every time I step into it. I mean, you can smell the Connolly leather from here. You can smell gasoline. My daughter hates it because of the smell of gasoline, but I love it for exactly the same reason. It's totally unreliable. I mean, we go somewhere, there's a 50-50 chance of whether you'll get there, but that's all part of the charm. It's a mistress that will beat you if you let it. But on the other hand, it can be the love of your life.
Bringing us full circle, I asked Andy about the little slice of engineer heaven he's built for himself and what the future holds.
Well, you know, as a 16-year-old, when you start an apprenticeship, back then, you spend 18 months in a tool room. I think that period of my life is really where I found myself. It's certainly where I found my voice, and it transformed from a spotty, shy boy into a less spotty, not so shy man. I love that period of my life, and you know, in wanting to create a garage for my cars, I wanted to create an area that allowed me partially to think about what things might look at after my career, what do I want to do when I retire, but also how do I want to continue the passion of what I do when I'm no longer an executive in the auto industry. And I thought, you know what I want to do? I want to recreate that tool room that I spent 18 months on. I want to recreate a passion for gearboxes. In my case, that means clocks. I want to recreate the forge that I had when I was at school. And so the space was created. Of course, it was created during COVID, so there's an office upstairs, but it was mainly created around that vision of the tool room when I was 16 years old. And so the vertical miller, the lathe, the welding kit, the box bender, the forge, and the measuring and marking out areas are all things that basically I was really good at when I was 17 years old. I'm not very good at now, and the passion is to relearn how to use all that stuff. The next baby is actually a van. I'm chief executive of Switch Mobility, which is a bus and van company. I'm also chairman of Innobat, which is a manufacturer of EV batteries. I'm chairman of a company called Hilo, which is a EV scooter business. I'd like to say the Volvo of scooters. I'm also founder of Palmer Automotive, which is a consulting capability. And probably the most important one is being a trustee and the founder trustee of the Palmer Foundation. Palmer Foundation is a charity which takes disadvantaged kids and gets them into apprenticeships. Leaf was tremendous success as the first electric car, but it was also a failure of net zero carbon, because the carbon that you produce in making a vehicle wasn't eliminated. The carbon that you produce in charging a car wasn't eliminated. And so when I came out of Aston, I wanted closure on that failure. I wanted to pay my little part to the democratization of zero emission or net zero carbon. Electric cars are expensive, but 15 years later, you've got the knowledge of how to lower their cost. And to me, there's nothing more democratizing than creating a $15,000 van. Bloody hard, because as I said, cost management of an automobile is probably the most boring part of the industry, but it's also the hardest part of the industry. And so, what I've tried to do with Switch is create an environment where you're certified net carbon zero, first car company in the world, I believe, but you're not creating expensive, unaffordable, beautiful things. You're creating transportation for the mass, buses, vans, taxis, and that means they have to be affordable. And so Switch and its daughter company OHM, on the one hand, is around making the vehicles as low cost as they can be, and on the other hand, with OHM, it's about mobility as a service. In other words, rather than you buying the vehicle, why don't you essentially lease it from us, and then you just pay the pounds per mile or rupees per kilometre. And so that's broadly, where I'm focused now. And of course, the battery business that I chair is a part of that. The scooter business is part of the point to point. And it's all around just a little contribution towards, I hope, saving the planet.
And there we have it, a brief but hopefully enlightening chat with a man who has seen the car industry from the inside, outside, the bottom and the top, but is still in love with it. A huge thank you to Andy for his time, to my friend Antony for helping film this piece, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below and subscribe if you haven't already. Bye bye.